So good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining today for a presentation of the RISE 1 Endline evaluation findings. So I see some more folks joining us. If you just joined, please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling from today. And speaking of introductions, my name is Maya Persson. I am a senior advisor for knowledge management and communications with Save the Children, supporting the IDEAL activity and all the associate awards. One of these associate awards being the RISE 2 evaluation, the host of today's session. Today's presentation will be in English, but we offer simultaneous interpretation in French. So to access the French channel, please click on the little globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It should say interpretation. So if you click there and then you click French. If you want to stay in the English channel, you click English. We do ask everybody to choose a language. Once you have chosen your language, you can choose to either mute the original audio or you can keep it on at a lower volume in the background. So again, please choose your preferred language, English or French. And for those who want to listen in English, if you choose the English channel, that will make it possible for you also to hear translation from French in case there would be a question in French or anything else in French. So thank you for that. So in addition to hearing the French channel, you can also choose to view the slide deck in French. And you do that by going to the top of your Zoom screen where it says view options. If you click on that, you can choose to see either my screen or my colleague Matheson's screen for French. So that is an option you have to view the slide deck in either English or French. So before we get going, I wanted to make sure you have access to all the materials that we have produced around the RISE project so far. We have gathered them on a page in the FSN Network Resource Library. We are pasting the link in the chat so that you can access that. And I wanted to note that the RISE 1 Endline evaluation, which will be the focus of today's presentation, was conducted under the Real Associate Award, which is a different associate award from this one, funded by the USAID Center for Resilience under the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. But today's session is hosted by the RISE 2 evaluation activity. And just a little bit about the RISE 2 evaluation. We are a 2-year activity, just got started in 2024. We are funded by the USAID Sahel Regional Office and implemented by Save the Children and Tango International. We're an associate award under the IDEAL activity, and we work to determine the progress and impact of the RISE 2 project's resilience programming in the Sahel. We'll produce and communicate timely resilience analysis to inform adaptive management and also future programming in the region. So you can see an overview of the upcoming research activities along the timeline at the bottom of the slide, which includes one cycle of recurrent monitoring surveys, which will include 3 rounds. And after that, we'll do an endline survey at the very end of 2025 and beginning of 2026. All right, so thank you for bearing with me so far. Before we actually get started with the presentation, I also just wanted to draw your attention to the Q&A box. And so I thought I had a slide on that. I don't, but as you listen to the presentation, please put your questions as you think of them in the Q&A box. Please try to avoid putting them in the chat so that we have them all in one place. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a little icon, a little box called Q&A. So you click that, and then you can just add questions as we go along and listen to the presentation. And then at the end, we'll of course try and answer as many questions as possible. All right, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Tim Frankenberger, president and co-founder of Tango International. I think if I were to try and summarize all Tim's experience and expertise in international development and resilience measurement, we would never get started with this presentation. So rather, I will, without further ado, just hand it over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Maya. Can you all hear me? I hope so. So we're going to be presenting the results that came out of the RISE 1 Endline. The RISE project, the Resilience in the Sahel Enhance, Part 1, was a project that was implemented between 2014 and 2019. The major goal of it was to increase the resilience to shocks of chronically vulnerable populations in agro-pastoral and marginal agricultural livelihood zones of West Africa. And to reach this overall goal, they had 3 specific objectives. Next slide, please. First was to increase the sustainable economic well-being of households through diversifying economic opportunities by intensifying production and marketing, improving access to financial services, and increasing access to market infrastructure. They also tried to strengthen institutions and governance through improved natural resource management, disaster risk management, strengthening conflict management systems, and strengthening government and regional capacity and coordination. Finally, they were trying to improve health and nutrition status through increased access to potable water, improved health and nutrition practices, particularly for mother and children, and improving family planning and better sanitation practices. At the same time that they were trying to do these things, Food for Peace and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance were also implementing projects aimed at trying to do life-saving interventions in the same area. And eventually, as we know, those 2 branches of AID were merged into BAHA, and that happened in June 2020. Next slide, please. So this presentation tries to document the key findings coming out of the Endline survey, which was carried out October-September 2020 as part of an impact evaluation of the project. The Endline survey sampled 1,753 households residing in 88 villages and included both a quantitative and a qualitative component. The Endline was designed as a panel survey, so we were trying to collect data from the same households that participated in the midline survey. If you remember, those of you that have been around long enough, the baseline and the midline were actually not panel. They were collected from the same villages, but not the same household. So we tried to make sure that the evaluation concentrated on the midline to the endline using the same households. This was because we really wanted to measure the change in resilience that was going on for those same households. One of the problems that this survey faced was COVID-19 hit in 2020. And so we not only had that kind of restricting transport and access to areas, but we had an unprecedented number of climate and conflict shocks that were happening in the same place. So we weren't able to go to the original 100 baseline villages. We were only able to go to about 88 of them. And this is why the sample size was a little bit smaller than the original, which was 2,492 was the original. Next slide, please. So this slide tries to show you that in the baseline to the midline, we had pretty normal operations. There was relatively fewer shocks that were hitting these households. But then from the midline on, we had extreme multi-hazard escalating shock environment. And that's when the RISE evaluation period was happening. And these shocks disrupted interventions, and it made it difficult for any kind of a safety net to also be implemented out there simply because it was impossible for humanitarian actors to get to many of these places. Next slide, please. So we measure resilience in 2 ways. First, we look at realized resilience, and what that is an ex-ante objective indicator that tries to capture the trajectory of food security over the course of the shock period. So We are measuring the total change in food security between the midline and the endline survey. And what we also are looking at is whether households, through their own words, have an ability to recover from specific series of shocks that occurred. This is household perceived ability to recover. So we have a subjective experiential indicator that allows us to know whether a household themselves think they recovered from those shocks. So we've got these two measures, realized resilience and household perceived ability to recover. Next slide, please. This is the Tango conceptual framework that we use. So we try to look at pre-shock food security and the context before the project starts to get implemented. We have a series of shocks and stressors that are hitting. We have different kinds of capacity people draw on. These are the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities that try to mitigate these shocks and stresses. And they combine these things into different kinds of coping and adaptive strategies. And if they're successful, we should see an improvement in the food security, or at least a flattening out of that. Or if they're not successful, we start to see a collapse or things getting worse. So this is basically the way that we are trying to capture resilience over time. Next slide, please. So the main technique that we're using in this impact evaluation to understand whether resilience strengthening interventions implemented by RISE 1 actually did serve to build resilience and resilience capacities is difference in difference propensity score matching. This is where we try to match up households with similar characteristics to see if they actually did improve on many of these measures that we're looking at. So the evaluation period that we're talking about is between the midline and the end line. And we also, we needed this panel because we wanted to try to capture realized resilience. And this was this change in food security in the face of those shocks and stresses over time. Next slide. So we had a number of research questions that we were trying to answer. In terms of contextual research questions, we wanted to know what shocks did households experience over the project period, and how did their shock exposure and coping strategies change as they were dealing with this. Second, we wanted to know what changes have taken place in their resilience capacities and what changes took place in poverty and women's empowerment. Third, we wanted to know how resilient were households to these shocks that they faced. Did they see any improvement in their resilience? And then fourth, were resilience capacities, which specific capacities help them do this better? Next slide, please. In terms of the impact evaluation, we wanted to see whether the RISE 1, what kind of impact did those interventions being promoted by RISE 1, how did that help them deal with these shocks? Was there some advantage of having multiple comprehensive interventions working together to bring about resilience? What RISE 1 interventions helped the most in helping them recover? What impact did RISE have on poverty and women's empowerment? Did direct participation in these RISE interventions make a difference? Or was it just indirect exposure? So the reason we are interested in that is many interventions that were being promoted by RISE are at the systems level. So if you're establishing new services or new kinds of things that people can get access to, like vet services or health services, that has an effect on people. But we also know that if people actually do use those services and participate in those services, it might have a bigger effect. We wanted to see if that was the case. Next slide, please. So let's move to our findings. Next slide. Okay, what we found was that as these households, especially from the midline to the end line, they were experiencing increased shock exposure. It was especially sharp escalation in the last couple of years of the project, which put them in an unprecedented crisis. According to we were using a global climate database looking at rainfall patterns, and we found that households were subjected to great rainfall volatility, leading to multiple droughts and floods in the project area. So not only were they experiencing this rainfall volatility, but they were experiencing increasing conflict shocks, as well as COVID-19. All of these things were coinciding at the same time. So it was a very difficult environment for households to cope with. Flooding dominated over drought in the last years of the project as well. Next. What happened then with all of this volatility in both in climate and in violence, we get a lot of displaced populations that were moving around. And so we know that this had a widespread impact on markets, on agricultural production, on off-farm income generating opportunities, and on people's lives, livelihoods, and health. Next slide. So by April 2020, when the COVID-19 restrictions were put in place, we see border closures, we see market restrictions, we see people restricted in travel. Even the implementing partners had trouble getting around. We know that those of you who work for AID, many of those people had to go back to the States when COVID hit. We also see this combination of climate shocks, civil insecurity, and COVID really led to a lot of economic shocks. So food prices started to go up, unemployment started to go up, particularly for the informal sector folks. And it was very difficult for humanitarian assistance to get out to these areas as well. So we see a large number of households starting to report more serious illnesses and death, particularly in Burkina Faso. And it was a clear indication that the multiple shocks at the time really took a serious toll on the well-being of these households. Other shocks that rocked these folks were, we saw not only the civil insecurity and displacement, but we saw fall armyworm and other infestations that damaged crops. So it was an unbelievable precedent with regards to the exposure to different shocks going on in this area. Next slide. So one of the things that pandemic really shook things up because it really made it difficult for any kind of economic activity to go. You couldn't bring things across the border. There were restrictions in travel. Markets were shutting down. And so this transport disruptions, we start to see these consumer prices go up dramatically, disruption of the agriculture and livestock markets. We saw a lot of negative impact on people's livelihoods. Very few households reported that they actually got any kind of COVID, but the shocks that were created by the pandemic were more the containment measures that were put in place. So on top of all of the other shocks, these unprecedented climate shocks that people were getting, the unprecedented increase in violence, it was all of those restrictions and containment caused by the policies put in place that led to increasing costs of gasoline and transport, closing down markets, making it very difficult for people to make a living. Next slide. So they intensified and then shifted their coping strategies to try to deal with all of these shocks. And the most common one that was employed was to sell livestock, where we found that over 2/3 of the households were getting rid of livestock as a way to cope. Others were trying to borrow money or receive gifts of money from friends and relatives. They reduced their food consumption. They changed the sources of food they ate. They drew down on their savings. They migrated, and they borrowed from moneylenders. So even though we saw a large number of households diversify their livelihoods, it was diversifying into very low return activities, such as working on other people's fields, charcoal production, wild food sales, and petty trading. So if everybody's kind of doing the same thing, then nobody makes very much money. So it doesn't really help you cope that well with how things are going. We also saw a lot of negative coping strategies being employed, where people were taking their children out of school, they were sending them to work for money, they were selling productive assets, they were borrowing from moneylenders and getting into huge debt, and they were compromising their health by reducing the food they were consuming. They couldn't rely on humanitarian assistance because in fact, it was declining in the area. And what we found was very few people actually did have access to any kind of safety net to help them deal with this shock exposure. Next slide. Now, as I said before, we're very much interested in resilience capacities that people use to mitigate the shocks that they're exposed to. We have these three categories. We have absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. Under each of these, we have a series of components that we are looking at in detail to see if any of these things had an influence on people's ability to manage shocks and make them more resilient. So we're looking at these different kinds of social capital, asset ownership, whether people had access to any kind of informal safety nets, what kinds of hazard insurance did they have, were they supporting conflict mitigation, Were they engaged in kind of other employment opportunities? Did they have access to financial services? Were they getting exposed to new information that would have helped them to cope? Did they have improved access to markets? Were they getting better access to services? Did they have better communal natural resource management? What kinds of formal safety nets were available? So we're looking at a range of things that enable these households and communities manage these shocks and stresses more effectively. And we wanted to see which of these actually made a bigger difference. Next slide. So when we kind of look at all of this together, what we found was there wasn't really any improvement in overall resilience capacity in the RISE 1 area since the baseline. And that was primarily because of this huge shock exposure that people were dealing with. We saw declines in absorptive capacity due to the erosion of households' holdings of savings and their access to informal safety nets. We saw a decline in transformative capacity linked to the decline in access to markets and basic services. Particularly when conflict hit and when COVID hit, a lot of the access to those services went away. We saw some improvements in adaptive capacity, but this was probably due to the fact that people were diversifying into different kinds of livelihood activities, but that didn't have that big of an impact in terms of income generating. We saw improvements in human capital, but that might have been the fact that as COVID hit, a lot of households were absorbing other people coming from urban areas or from displacement. And so there could have been some educated, literate people that were coming and joining the households. That would show that human capital was increasing. What we found in terms of differences across the project area, Niger area fared much better in maintaining household resilience capacities than Burkina Faso did. Next slide. But our analysis wasn't all negative. What we found was that those who did have good absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities were more likely to recover from these escalating and multifaceted shocks that they faced. And the ones that we found that were statistically significant were bonding social capital, bridging social capital, asset ownership, holding of savings, livelihood diversity, human capital, exposure to information, and aspirations and confidence to adapt. Now, when we looked across all of the surveys, this was the baseline survey, the midline survey, the RMS that was carried out in 2018 and 19, and the Endline, the capacities that consistently help households recover were social capital, the bonding, the bridging, and the linking types, economic sources of resilience, such as holding savings and asset ownership, disaster preparedness and mitigation, human capital and exposure to information, and aspirations and confidence to adapt. So what we found then is that those people that were able to maintain these resilience capacities were able to manage these shocks effectively. Next slide. When we run the model, particularly on absorptive capacity, we find that higher levels of absorptive capacity enable people to stay more food secure than those with lower levels of absorptive capacity. And so that really tells us that these capacities make a difference and enable people to absorb these shocks. Next slide. So, and the other thing that we were interested in, if you remember the research questions, we were really interested in whether or not combining interventions, overlaying these different interventions made a difference. And what we found was 7 out of the 8 project interventions, when you actually found them working together in an area, when households are exposed to those 7 or 8 interventions, we saw that it had a huge positive impact on 4 of the 8 capacities: asset ownership, bridging social capital, livelihood diversity, and exposure to information. Next slide. So investments in agricultural production had a positive impact on asset ownership, bridging social capital, and aspirations and confidence to adapt. Community natural resource management and disaster preparedness and mitigation interventions, they had a positive impact on household holding of cash savings, livelihood diversity, and exposure to information. Market and business development interventions also had a positive impact on holdings of cash savings, and financial services had a positive impact on 2 of the resilience strengthening capacities: asset ownership and aspirations and confidence to adapt. Governance, and this is a really important one, governance interventions had a positive impact on almost all of the 8 resilience capacities that enabled households to recover from shocks. So investment in governance type interventions really made a difference. Next slide. So even though we saw a steep decline in food security over the operational period in both Burkina and Niger, and this was because of all these shocks people were exposed to, we already knew that from the very beginning, and this had a lot to do for why RISE was targeting these vulnerable populations, using HFIAS measure of food security. We saw that it was 70% at the beginning of the project, but it got over to 90% by the end of the project. But the prevalence of severe food insecurity also increased. This is when people go whole days without eating. That nearly doubled over the project period from 26 to 49%. And according to the realized resilience measure we have, they were not able to maintain their midline food security or get back to it by the end line. But we did find 44% of the households were resilient, while the rest were not. So what we're trying to say is, even though we did find that those different resilience capacities and the interventions that were promoting those resilience capacities are important, 44% of the households were able to maintain their resilience in the face of all of those shocks that they were exposed to. But when we look at people's own perception of their ability to recover, we saw that decline from 13.9% at the midline to just 5.7% at the end line. So things were getting bad and worse in this area, and it was having a negative effect on some of the major outcome measures that we're interested in. Next slide. So this is illustrated, but when we look at food security between the baseline and the end line, you can see that it got worse in both Burkina Faso and Niger. Next slide. Also, the prevalence of poverty was much higher in Niger than it was in Burkina Faso from the very beginning. But we saw Niger area started out as a very high prevalence of poverty at 78.8% at the baseline, whereas in Burkina Faso it was 49%. While the poverty prevalence stayed steady between the baseline and the end line in Niger, it actually increased in Burkina Faso from 49 to 57%. Next slide. But women's empowerment, we have some positive things to say about that. Women's empowerment saw significant improvements in the Niger area, especially between the midline and the end line. The results are less clear for Burkina Faso area, with some aspects of empowerment improving, especially regarding asset ownership, while others didn't see much change. The qualitative data also highlights these changes in the role of women due to economic empowerment that allowed them to help cover household expenses much more easier. Next slide. Okay, so we wanted to see if engagement in resilience enhancing interventions really made a difference in terms of an impact of the evaluation. So what we found was project interventions were basically broken out into 8 categories. We had improved technologies and management practices with regards to agriculture production, improved technologies and management practices with regards to livestock rearing, community natural resource management, market and business development, financial services, human capital investments, disaster preparedness and mitigation, and governance. And we also were looking at indices of exposure to interventions and participation in those interventions. What we recognize is that comprehensive, cross-sectoral nature of RISE 1 project, we could actually look at projects working together and projects pulled out separately. So when we found that when you had households that were exposed to or participating in the 7 or 8 of the intervention sets, we classified that as a comprehensive resilience programming. Next slide. So 43% of the households residing in the RISE 1 area were exposed to comprehensive resilience programming, and 12% directly participated in it. Burkina Faso households were more likely to be exposed to and participate in comprehensive resilience programming. Very few households reported relying on any humanitarian assistance over the RISE 1 period, despite the escalating shock exposure. For example, only 1/4 of the households received any food assistance over the entire 5-year period, and just over 10% received cash assistance. So humanitarian assistance declined over the project period, despite the fact that there was an increasing shock exposure. And part of it had to do with the fact that it was very difficult to get into these areas because of COVID lockdown and because of conflict that was going on in many of these areas. Next slide. So the way that we are looking at exposure and participation to comprehensive resilience programming is we have these 8 intervention sets, and we look at whether or not a household was exposed to any of those. And we have these 8 intervention sets, and we try to see if any households are participating in it. Next slide. So what our analysis tells us is that households that were exposed to CRP, it did indeed strengthen their resilience despite the extreme shocks that they were exposed to. So the gains were essentially, it led to a 9.9 percentage point smaller decrease in food insecurity than it otherwise would have been. So it led to smaller increase in the prevalence of severe food security. So even though food security got worse, participating in these comprehensive resilience programming activities actually made a difference in preventing that slide from getting worse. So it had a positive impact on people's absorptive and adaptive capacities, but the impact on transformative capacity, not so much. And that had a lot to do with the fact that markets were shutting down and services were more difficult to deliver. Next slide. So when we look at individual resilience capacities, the programming levers for bringing about improvements in these capacities and thus resilience, we see that availability of hazard insurance made a difference. So did access to disaster preparedness and mitigation. Asset ownership made a difference. Bridging social capital, livelihood diversity, access to financial services, exposure to information, and access to infrastructure and access to formal safety nets. So direct participation of households in CRP benefited in terms of improvements in resilience and resilience capacity. Households benefited more from the participation in that than they did by just being exposed to it. But what we found, though, was exposure did make a difference as well. Next slide. So when we look at comprehensive resilience programming, the treatment group did not go down as fast in terms of changes in food security as the control group did. So participating in multiple interventions like this, as what the RISE 1 was trying to promote, did make a difference. Next slide. When we look at things like drought, and when we look at things like flooding, participation in CRP makes a huge difference. You can see that the red line for drought, that one is CRP interventions. The purple line for flood, that is the CRP intervention. So it really does make a difference when you dealing with these climatic shocks by participating in these multiple interventions. Next slide. The impact of the exposure to these comprehensive resilience programming on resilience was much stronger in Burkina Faso than it was in Niger. Where we did see impact of CRP on absorptive capacity was stronger in Niger area, and the impact of CRP on transformative capacity was stronger in the Burkina Faso area. Looking individually at the contributions of the 8 intervention sets, 4 had clear positive impact on both resilience and resilience capacities. Again, governance. Remember I said before, governance had such a huge impact on resilience capacities. Human capital, investment in human capital makes a difference. Disaster preparedness and mitigation, that makes a huge impact on absorptive capacity for sure. But access to financial services, that is the big one. Financial services had the strongest positive impact on resilience of all the intervention sets that were there. Next slide. So, well, we found that exposure to CRP didn't have a significantly impact on poverty. It did boost households' ownership of farming equipment, livestock, and land. So even though there are other convening factors that have an influence on poverty, we do see that it makes a difference in terms of these investments. Financial services and disaster preparedness and mitigation did have an impact on poverty. Some interventions rendered a positive impact on women's empowerment, but some of them had a negative impact. So intervention sets that had clear positive impacts on market-based development and financial services, both of which strengthened women's decision-making power and their ownership of assets relative to men. So getting women involved in market-based development and getting them access to financial services makes a difference. Next slide. Now, what are the program implications for all of this? Well, number one, we know that the humanitarian development peace nexus, HDP nexus, is crucial for resilience programming. Even though we try to make sure that the development activities that we engage in strengthen these resilience capacities and enable people to manage their shocks more effectively, sometimes the shock environment is going to be so strong, so big, so powerful that we need to have some way of protecting those investments. And that's where this humanitarian safety network comes into play. We also know that when conflict increases in an area, particularly when terrorism gets worse, we need to have something focused on peace that allows us to make sure that we don't lose all of our investments. So these shock responsive safety nets are going to be critical in these areas. And unfortunately, there was not a big shock responsive safety net available to these households, even though they were experiencing all of these shocks. We also know that comprehensive resilience programming really optimizes resilient impact. And so those who designed RISE 1 and RISE 2 we're on the right track, thinking that it is important to layer these interventions because it's the combination of the interventions that makes a difference. We also know that participating in interventions even makes a bigger difference than just being exposed to these interventions. So what we think is important going forward is that any way that we can encourage households to participate in these new systems level changes that we're bringing about is going to really make a difference in bringing about more resilience for those households. We also know that governance, those interventions focused on governance, on human capital, on disaster preparedness and mitigation, and financial services are going to have a huge positive impact on resilience and resilience capacities. And these are things that should continue to be critical to investment that we're doing in the Sahel. And so there is solid evidence from our study that these interventions are important for achieving resilience in the face of shocks in the RISE 1 area. And they will continue to be so as part of RISE 2. Next slide. We also know that attention to gender targeting and analysis is also going to be critical to enhancing positive impacts and avoiding negative impacts of interventions on women's empowerment. And we saw that gender targeting and analysis really did make a difference. And involving women in governance and market-based development also makes a huge difference for women's empowerment. We also know that things have gotten worse. In fact, those of you who will attend the in-person workshop for RISE 2 will know that violent extremism has increased. In fact, what we found in the baseline was that 40% of the households have been exposed to some terrorism within the year of that study. So it's gotten worse. So that's why these peace initiatives and conflict mitigation measures, as well as early warning and monitoring of potential violent encounters, are going to be critical for helping us make sure that we anticipate where some of these events are going to take place. We also know that as violence takes place, a lot of households are going to be displaced and they go to other host communities. And these host communities are taking on a large number of households. So, for example, what we found was households grew from a size of 7 to a size of over 15 in the RISE 1 period. That means they have 8 more people they have to help feed in their household. Was good reason why the food security got worse in many of those households. So investments in disaster preparedness and mitigation also make a big difference, particularly when we know that floods are a real problem in these areas. And so it's not just a drought, even though we often think of the Sahel as a drought-prone area. Floods really were a significant problem in these areas as well. So we have to make sure that we have proper interventions that allow us to deal with that. Next slide, please. Again, I want to emphasize financial services is proven to be one of the more critical investments that we made in trying to build resilience. And we saw it decline in Burkina Faso over the course of Rise 1. That had a lot to do probably with the fact that as violence increased in Burkina, it was more difficult for those financial services to actually take place. So we want to make sure that we keep our eye on that going forward. And also, it's important that we have panel data so that we can actually see whether we're making a difference over the whole course of the project. One of the handicaps that we had in the Rise 1 Endline was that we were only had the panel from the midline because we couldn't do it from the baseline, because that was not a panel study from the baseline to the midline. But going forward, Rise 2 does have panel all the way. So we will have a much longer time frame to be looking at impact over time. Next slide. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Maya, you're on.
I'm here. Thank you so much, Tim. I will now take down this presentation, and we're moving into Q&A. So if you haven't yet put any questions in the Q&A box, please do so. And I am now joined by Doug Brown and Mark Langworthy, researchers from the Tango team, who will help Tim answer the questions you may have. So also, of course, feel free to raise your hand and ask your question live by speaking. You can unmute and you can ask your question. And you can ask them in French or English, whatever you prefer. Over to you, Doug.
Okay, thank you very much. We actually have one question here right now. We'll just answer it. I'll ask it first. It's from the person is asking, can you share an example of an intervention that decreased women's empowerment?
I'd have to go back and look. Doug, do you remember in the analysis, was there? I can't remember.
I can't remember specific interventions, no, right offhand. I'd have to go back and look at the data.
Right. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that, okay, if that's okay. It's actually, you have access to all of the documents now in the thing that Maya shared with you. And so if you go into the Rise 1 Endline, you'll see that in some of the tables, some of the interventions, there might be a negative for the gender issue.
Okay, and there's another question here as well. How did you differentiate households that participated versus households that were simply exposed?
We tried to determine whether or not interventions were when we had community questionnaires, and so we were asking people in the community, were they exposed to any of these list of interventions that we had access to? And then we asked the households themselves if they were also, did they participate in any of these same interventions? And so that's how we were able to determine it. You could have a systems level intervention that the community would be exposed to, but not everybody in the community might have participated in that. And that's how we got that difference. Modu.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Great presentation. Maybe I missed it, but it just seems like one of the slides you've said that, did you say the exposure to the CRP was less likely in Burkina Faso, yet it had a great...
No, it was more likely in Burkina.
It was more likely. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, and it has a greater impact on,
Right.
on the resilience
Right.
outcomes as well. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. I thought less likely. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And then somebody asked, why were 44% of the households able to stay resilient and the rest weren't? Well, a lot of that had to do with the set of capacities they already had. And so they were able to rely on those capacities, whereas other households that had fewer of those capacities were not. And so even though, so you have to remember that people aren't starting from scratch. They have a lot of things that they use themselves to manage shocks and stresses. And what the projects are trying to do is enhance those capacities. We're trying to build more of those capacities, particularly for people that don't have those things. And so the project was successful in doing that, but we also have to recognize that there is variability within the population, and some people just have more capacities than others, and they're able to maintain their food security in the face of all those shocks. Yeah, Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think just to follow up on that as well, I think the other big reason why we saw a decline in resilience was, as Tim laid out, during this period, the households were exposed to many different kinds of shocks and sort of cumulative effect of shocks. That was a major factor that led to the decline of resilience capacity of many households over this time period. In fact, to me, the interesting thing is that it wasn't a greater percentage that showed a decline in resilience.
Right. Right. You have to remember, not everybody is, when some of those displacements happen because of terrorism, or displacement happen with regards to shutdown of markets or economic opportunities, people couldn't travel like they could before. Those households were the ones that were really negatively affected. And other villages may not have been exposed to that much violence, or maybe weren't exposed to the same kind of economic shocks. And so there's a lot of variability out there in the RISE 1 target area. So we just have to recognize that. In fact, that's how we learn. We learn about from households that are able to manage it, and tell us which households can't manage it. What do we need to help them manage it better? Henry Paul. Go ahead. Go ahead. Henry Paul. You're on mute if you're trying to say something.
Oh, he's connecting now to audio. He may want to ask the question in French, so you need to wait for it to be translated. Henri Paul.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello, do you hear me?
We do. We hear you. Henri
My
Paul.
mic is open.
Yeah, we hear you. We hear you. You can't hear me?
He may be listening on the wrong channel. If he was listening on the French, he wouldn't be hearing your answer necessarily.
Do you hear me?
Can somebody send him a message?
Oh. Very sorry about that. Let's continue. I have a.
Could somebody please just put in the chat for Henri Paul that he could type his question?
Do you hear me now?
We have two other questions here we can answer while we try.
Yeah, Henry Paul, we hear you. Can you hear us?
Okay, thanks. My question was very simple. I noticed that you mentioned governance and financial provision of financial services and market-oriented, something like that. So my question was to know what was the proportion of those how can I term them, those subjects in the RISE 1 umbrella programming. What was the proportion of those elements, those factors that were that proved to be very successful in the during the evaluation?
Yeah. So if you remember in the presentation, I said governance had almost across the board on all resilience capacities, it had a positive impact. And financial service also had a huge impact. And so
yes.
what we think is when people feel like they're participating more and they can have their voice heard through village development committees to other branches of government, services get better, and they actually we see an improvement across the board with regards to these resilience capacities. So we think that the project having a focus on that really makes a difference. And we also think that the financial services, making sure people have resources so that they can diversify livelihoods, so that they can invest in livestock and more assets, really makes a big difference as well. And so those things really showed up as really, really important. Market-based development also is important, and that's that systems level change that's going on that allows people to have better access to not only other income opportunities, but better access to different kinds of commodities and things that they can buy and sell. That also helps improve their livelihood. So those things make sense in terms of the investments that you guys are making and how that had a positive impact on resilience.
Hey, Tim, there is actually a question here that's in French that is asking something related to that. So he was just, the person is asking if you could go find these in terms of-
Oh, you broke up there, Doug. What did you say?
Yeah, I understand.
What?
Yes, I was going to give him the question in English. I've already translated it myself.
Okay.
So can you go back over the findings on accessibility of financial services?
On the slide?
They want you to just review the answer a little bit.
Well, we don't have the slides up. I can't go back to it, but
Just
all I
read
can-
the person wants you to restate what the findings were.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So what we found was that financial services, people's access to financial services had a huge impact on resilience capacities and their resilience in the sense of their ability to manage shocks and stresses over time. And what is critical about that is people, when they have access to financial services, they can diversify their livelihoods much easier. They can invest in assets that allow them to manage shocks better. They can be much more adaptive in terms of their approach to these shocks and stresses. Now, one of the problems is when conflict hits, a lot of those financial services shut down and get worse. That's what we saw in Burkina Faso as conflict increased in Burkina. Access to those financial services got worse as well. And so we want to make sure that as we're dealing with this varied shock environment, that some of the things that are showing up as being really important, we don't lose them. And governance is also negatively affected by terrorism. And when services start to go down because government staff don't want to stay in the area because of conflict, it makes it very difficult to have any kind of services, whether you're talking about access to schools or access to healthcare or access to vet services. Those things go down in the face of conflict as well. So, some of the things that we're showing is having the biggest impact are also the ones that are negatively affected by a changing environment where conflict is increasing.
Yeah, Tim, there's a couple of questions that are related, so I'll give you the two of them together here. You referenced the positive impact of governance interventions. Can you please share more details on this? And then the other person is asking also, which kind of governance interventions were evaluated at which level, community, state, so on?
We were evaluating community, and it was primarily how village development committees actually then feed into local government structures, making sure that voice of communities are heard, that people's needs are expressed and services are then matched up to those needs. It's that kind of interconnection between local government and village development committees that has been critical. And when women have voice in those committees, they're more likely to have services that are appropriate to them being provided. So that's what we're talking about here.
Sorry, Leah, let me just jump in also. I think in relation to the findings around financial interventions, we in a number of studies that we've done in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, we get very similar findings, namely that the elements that are a consistent finding is that components of resilience capacity that turn out to be very important in terms of households' ability to recover from shocks are assets and access to savings. And also what we find is that the impacts of financial interventions that, sort of help to strengthen those elements of resilience capacities they show very strong impacts. So this is a general finding that we see, not just in the RISE findings, but it's a general across in other regions where we've done similar studies. Over.
Okay, Tim, another question here. By looking at the RISE 2 design, do you think that the changes introduced in the design are consistent with the Endline findings?
Yes, I think that there are a number of elements in the RISE 2 that can build on the things that came out of the RISE 1. The one thing that so for example, governance is really highly emphasized. So is our access to financial services. So is the targeting of women's empowerment as being key, and youth as well. So I think there's a lot of things that are pulled into RISE 2 that are going to hopefully show benefit. One of the things, though, that I am worried about is access to safety nets is still not widespread in the baseline findings of RISE 2. And so I am a little bit worried about that as the shock environment, particularly with regards to conflict, gets worse in these two countries. That safety net is just not there. And so and part of the reason I don't think it can be blamed on the project itself, we know that cash transfers are kind of viewed in a negative way by these two governments because they think that the money could easily go to the terrorist groups. And so that makes it very difficult when cash transfers are something that really could help households deal with this stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a hand up there, Tim.
Abraham, yeah.
Ibrahim, but there's another question here I think you might want to address first. Has the impact of health on household resilience been assessed?
Yeah, we have been assessing that. And we know that the health actually declined for women and children, but particularly with regards to, a lot of it had to do with negative trends in malnutrition. So, there's a couple of things happening here. One is as diets got worse, malnutrition got worse, people's access to health clinics got worse because many of these services that were being provided shut down because of conflict, or maybe they didn't have access to medicines in these clinics. All of these things have an impact. So it doesn't mean that we don't think that health interventions are important. We think that they are very important for this population. One of the things that we found was that there were a lot more deaths recorded in households. And a lot of that had to do with illness that people were exposed to. And so, as you have all of these different shocks hitting, and people are trying to deal with that, and their food security is getting worse, and their health service access gets worse, you're going to see a lot more illness and a lot more deaths in these families. And we actually we did record a lot more household deaths than we thought we'd find. Particularly in the Endline survey, we found a lot of households that suffered deaths in the family recently. So somebody had their hand, Abraham had his hand up. Do we know what Abraham wanted to ask?
No, we don't know, just waiting.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. My question concerned the sequencing or layering of intervention from your analysis. Was this a determining factor? Does the order of activity matters in this case? What do you have any example of combination of successful intervention?
You know, that's
Thank you.
something we're going to be. Well, if you remember my presentation, we talked about how certain interventions in combination made a big difference. The fact that 7 out of 8 of the intervention sets, if they overlap, that made a huge difference. That layering really was important. And what we will be doing in RISE 2 going forward in the analysis is looking at, do certain combinations of interventions make a bigger difference than other combinations? And so that will be part of our analysis.
Part of the reason for the upcoming workshop is to make sure we're addressing that. Tim, there's 2 other questions in the chat. One, I'll have to translate for you, but the first one is, understanding the nature and type of financial services contributing to an increased resilience capacity is crucial. Are we referring to VSLAs, community savings, or cooperatives, credit unions, or bank institutions when we're talking about financial services? Or are we also including money transfer mechanisms? Debt levels within these communities are also critical variables, often affecting their ability to recover from shocks and contributing to poverty. Therefore, clarifying the specific types of financial services under consideration is essential for a comprehensive understanding.
I couldn't agree more with that comment. I think a lot of the, Doug, you would know better than me. What kinds of financial services were we really talking about here?
We do break the survey itself breaks the financial services down into details, for sure, in terms of what type of financial institutions people engage with. And more details would be in the report than we have in the presentation here. I don't offhand remember what the relative engagement with the different types that they're referring to.
They were via VSL.
Yeah. In terms of the kinds of financial activities that were related to project interventions, those were the VSLA savings groups, and also access to microfinance organizations, typically through the VSLA groups.
But we can give you a big breakdown on that as well.
Yeah. Okay, there's another question that was asked in French, and I'll just summarize it for you in English. As part of their development policy, governments are focusing on setting up cooperatives, which are professional organizations. How have you assessed governance within cooperatives?
Doug, you would know.
We haven't specifically focused on the governance of particular cooperatives or the management of financial institutions, that sort of thing. More the matter of we've focused on how people have engaged with those institutions and whether or not they have.
But again, the workshop that we're about to have, the in-person workshop, what's really important about that workshop is if there are these kinds of issues that you guys think we should be looking at a little bit more carefully, we can make sure that maybe part of our qualitative inquiry actually explores that a little bit more.
Yeah. The Petra Bonometti, who asked the question about VSLAs and so on, had her hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to clarify my question because I'm from a WFP. We were implementing partners And we also conducted some analysis on the impact of our integrated resilience programs. And one of the considerations that came out in recent analysis was really the debt, and how the debt is really like a barrier for recovering for the households. So when we talk about financial services, for me, that would be really key, for example, to understand how we can impact and we can intervene in a positive way on the financial services. That means that households are better equipped to manage their financial resources without incurring in uncontrolled indebtedness, because that is a risk, you know. So the VSLA, for example, financial inclusion in this sense, the community mechanism, as I'm in the sector, are always positively evaluated. But on the credit, microcredit, I mean, maybe there's a floor for in-depth analysis on that kind if the RISE 1 evaluation is not given already a precision. But for me, that would be interesting to understand how we can really make better in this part of the intervention. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. That's really a good point. And you know, in other studies that we've carried out in other parts of the world, we really did look at the debt issue as a really big problem. You know, a lot of people, you know, like if you just see their house and it looks like they've got all these assets, but what's really hidden is how much debt they're in, and how that really hinders what they can do in terms of going forward. So, no, absolutely, I think that's a critical issue that we need to take into account.
I think just to follow up on that as well, it's probably important to emphasize that the RISE 1 study and the RISE 2 have both the quantitative and qualitative components. And I think the issue around indebtedness is one that we can certainly address in the quantitative component, but I think is also a very critical question that needs to be included in our qualitative component, because I think, you know, indebtedness is you know, there's sort of many sort of forms and characteristics of indebtedness, and it affects different households in different ways. So I think that's again a point well taken, and I think we need to think about how to incorporate it in both the quantitative and the qualitative components. Over.
Doug, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I just I'm looking at table 5 in the Endline report, and one of the shocks that is there is debt repayment, and you know 26.5% of households in Niger had that as one of the most critical shocks at the end line. Much fewer in Burkina Faso. So we do have more detail on the nature of the shocks, and indebtedness is or debt repayment is one of those issues. And then, of course, when we look at coping strategies, we've also look at various different sources of borrowing and stuff, as well as alternatives that people do engage in. So we do have more details as to the nature of indebtedness that people have, that they incur, and whether it's, and to what extent it's perceived as a shock that's affecting them.
Right, and we do also, as you said, in the coping strategies, when people are turning to money lenders and getting in more debt.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'd like to ask, if I could, a follow-up question to Ouedraogo around the question around cooperatives. And the question is could you give a bit more description of exactly what these organizations are? It says in here that they're professional organizations, but are these sort of cooperatives around economic activities, that is around collective marketing of products, or are they other kinds of cooperatives? Maybe if you could just provide a bit more detail about the kinds of cooperatives that you're talking about. Over.
That was a question for Bruno Ouedraogo, and I think he's in the French channel. So Eric, if you can translate that question for Mark, and then if Bruno could answer in French and Eric can interpret it for us here into the English. Thank you.
Voilà, donc je disais, moi c'est Bruno Ouedraogo, je travaille pour le projet USAID Degré. Il faut dire que au niveau de, nous travaillons sur 3 chaînes de valeur, notamment les petits ruminants, la volaille et le niébé, mais pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir plus d'opportunités, les producteurs sont organisés sous forme de coopératives, ce qui facilite quand même leur possibilité d'avoir accès aux intrants, d'avoir accès aux services financiers, d'avoir accès, de vendre collectivement leur production, etc. Donc, pour nous, ça reste vraiment une organisation assez importante parce que pour donner un peu plus de force à ces coopératives, elles ont mis en place quand même un certain nombre de comités qui leur permettent de travailler. Donc, aujourd'hui, nous avons constaté que beaucoup de choses sont faites au niveau des coopératives et certainement leur impact sur les ménages aussi se font sentir parce que les coopératives sont organisées de 2 ou 3 niveaux. Au niveau des villages, nous avons les coopératives simplifiées au niveau des villages avec au maximum 25 personnes. Et chaque coopérative maintenant s'unit en plusieurs coopératives au niveau d'une commune s'unissent pour créer une coopérative provinciale et plusieurs coopératives au niveau du village s'unissent pour créer la coopérative régionale ou communale ou départementale. Et tout ça, ce sont des entités qui mènent des activités économiques. Et pour qu'elles soient durables, il faut quand même que ces coopératives aient plus de gouvernance en leur sein. Et c'est dans ce volet-là que nous travaillons et nous avons quand même constaté beaucoup de changements au sein des producteurs pour tout ce qui est accès aux intrants, pour tout ce qui est accès pour vendre même leurs produits et même accès aux services financiers. Et dans ce cadre-là, nous travaillons vraiment en étroite collaboration avec Catalyse qui facilite l'accès des produits et des produits financiers. Et nous pensons que pour le moment, pour faciliter l'accès, la bonne gouvernance au niveau des organisations, il est bien pour nous que nous puissions travailler avec les entités que les États encouragent en réalité à faire émerger, notamment les coopératives et les différentes fédérations. Voilà. Merci.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. So I think that we will, as we are working on finalizing the design of the RISE 2 RMS and Endline tools, we will make sure that we capture more detailed information about cooperatives. Thank you. Over.
So I'm taking that by professional cooperative, he is referring to agricultural cooperatives. So that makes it clear. Tim, there's a couple of questions that were asked in the chat earlier on that slipped by me here. And they're very similar, so I'll just sort of try to reframe them together as one question. Are there specific recommendations that should be considered to help increase the impact of resilience interventions in these 2 countries moving forward? And the other person is looking specifically for program recommendations that should be considered moving forward as well.
Well, I thought well, I'm not sure in general, haven't we talked about different interventions that seem to be making a difference in terms of?
I think maybe they're wanting you to restate them in the sense of or highlight any particular ones that they're concerned that you think are appropriate.
Well, let me jump in and I can sort of give my my interpretation. I think two well, at least two important things are. One is these findings emphasize the importance of integrated, layered interventions. And certainly interventions we have from these findings have come out to be particularly important, namely financial interventions and governance. But then the other thing,
and disaster risk reduction and
disaster risk reduction,
and the human capital investment.
right? And then also the importance, I guess, really of the need for humanitarian assistance as a type of intervention to help to protect the investments that are made to enhance resilience capacities.
Right. And women's empowerment, making sure that women's empowerment is continued. And I think that's a big part of RISE too. So I think a lot of the things that are being emphasized in RISE 2 are things that we've shown in RISE 1 that made a difference. So it's just, when you've got a very difficult operating environment, it's hard to kind of implement the stuff that that makes the biggest difference. That's always going to be an issue. A complicated, risk-prone operating environment makes it hard to do good governance investments. Makes it difficult to maintain financial services. So we have to take that into account. You guys are working in one of the toughest environments in the world, and the fact that you're showing some progress is a good thing.
I think that's a really good note to wrap this session up with. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tim, Doug, Mark. If Matheson, you could put up that last slide about some next steps, that would be great. So before we say goodbye, just to talk about the next steps for the RISE 2 Evaluation Award, we already next week, I will be very happy to see some of you. I recognize names here in the list. So some of you will be gathering in Dakar for the Inception workshop. So that's our next step. Where we'll discuss the analysis findings even more in depth than we have done here today. We'll also dig into the RISE 2 baseline survey, and we'll talk about the upcoming data collection efforts, of course. Then in June, the data collection will start for the first round of RMS, and we'll then, for the rest of the year and into 2025, do the second and third rounds of the RMS. In about September, these dates are still to be confirmed, but around that timeline of September 2025, so that's next year, we'll have another in-person workshop where we'll discuss and digest the RMS findings and then inform the last Endline survey. And the Endline survey will be happening in December 2025 and January 2026. And that's to make sure that the data collection is happening at the same time of the year as the baseline did. And then around April 2026, we'll come up with a full Endline report and presentation. So those are some next steps for this award. And before we say goodbye, I would love for you to fill out a very quick survey about today's session. It is just 2 questions, or maybe 3, but it will take you less than 2 minutes to complete. So appreciate if you could do that. We will, of course, send out the link to the recording, this presentation, links to all our resources around the RISE project in an email to all of you after this session. Yeah, I think that's it. Any last words, Tim?
No, thanks for taking the time to listen to us, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time of your day to join us today. Thank you.